this is Manushka. Welcome to our Friends and Family YouTube channel. We're so excited that you have tuned in today. We believe here at VOUS that you never have to go at it alone. And so we've created content to help you along the journey. We believe that it's gonna be a blessing to your life. Check it out.
As we turn to Matthew chapter 26, we read about Jesus on the night that he was betrayed. He goes to a garden after the Last Supper, and we read here beginning at verse 36, "Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, 'Sit here while I go over there and pray.' He took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, 'My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me.' Going a little further, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, 'My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will.'" On the night Jesus was betrayed, he went to the garden to pray. Jesus took his disciples with him, but he asked most of them to give him space. "You guys stay right here." He took three of them, his closest ones, Peter, James, and John, and asking them to keep watch with him, he explained to them, "My soul is overwhelmed to the point of death." What was Jesus saying when he said that? Now, the word soul in the Bible, in the Greek psyche, does not simply mean the part of our consciousness that survives death. The soul here means our wholeness, that all of us, which expresses who we are, how we feel, all the way through. Our individuality, the home of our feelings and our choices. It's the same sense that we get in Psalm 103 when the psalmist says, "Bless the Lord, all my soul, and all that is within me." It's just a Hebrew way of saying the same thing twice. The soul is all that is within me. We're not just souls operating bodies. We're one unified entity whose continuation calls for the resurrection of the body. But on the night that Jesus is betrayed, just hours from a very physical torture and death, Jesus had an overwhelmed soul. And when Jesus says, "I'm overwhelmed by sorrow to the point of death," what he's saying is that I am so overtaken by sorrow through and through that I feel like I could die here. Now, this is somewhat similar to another story in the Bible, and it's the story of Jonah. And if you're reading the story of Jonah for the first time, you read about a man who is told by God as a prophet to go and preach against a wicked city, and Jonah immediately takes off and goes in the other direction. You don't know why he flees. We're not actually told that yet in the story. Finally, God gets his attention in an amazing way. God sends him back to the city. Jonah preaches against the city. Then in chapter 4, Jonah waits for God to destroy the city just like God said he would. And we read this amazing thing, that the city that was so wicked, God said, "In 40 days, I'm gonna destroy you." That very city repented. And because they repented, we have this beautiful word, this word in Jonah chapter 3, verse 10 that says, "And God saw their actions and God relented." God didn't bring the destruction that he promised. Now we come to chapter 4, and Jonah is upset. And Jonah, for the first time in the story, tells us why it is that he fled from God. "This is why I went in the other direction. This is why I would rather be thrown overboard than do what you say. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger, abounding in love. And that if I went to these people and told them they were going to be judged and they repented, you would forgive them because that's just how you are. And these are our enemies, and I didn't want them to receive that chance." God says to Jonah, are you angry about this? And Jonah says, I'm angry enough to die. The point of Jonah is, how are you going to act when God gives your enemies the same grace he gives you? Jonah in his soul was so overwhelmed with anger, he said, I could die over this. Jesus in his soul was so overwhelmed with sorrow, he said, I could die with this. The only difference is that Jonah's anger was because God showed mercy. The sorrow of Jesus is because God is about to show justice. Justice for the sake of mercy, by letting Jesus take the cup of God's wrath. Jesus has an overwhelmed soul. He feels what he feels deeply. He feels what he feels honestly. So what does Jesus do? Well, first, he prays to God for an answer. And I've always thought it was an amazing thing that at the Last Supper, Jesus already proclaimed his death as the basis for a new covenant. And in the garden, he asked God if there's another way. Is there any way for this cup to pass from me? Now, through the Gospels, we see Jesus spending time in prayer. Being Jesus didn't stop him from being with God. He had no problem turning to the Father. But on the hardest day of his life, when he turned to God in prayer, he didn't just turn to God, he trusted God. And how do we know that? Because we turn to God when we have a need, but we trust God when God says no to our request. Jesus could say, I'm turning to you with this request, but if you say no, not my will, but your will be done. He didn't just turn to God, he trusted God. Jesus also turned to his friends for support. He asked most of his disciples to stay in another part of the garden, but he took his closest friends with him to watch and to pray. And Jesus had no problem admitting to his feelings in the face of this coming trial. How many of you know that sometimes as leaders, we don't want the people around us to see how scared we are? We don't want the people around us to know about our fears. And of course, we may not want to do this from the stage, but there are people in our life who are meant to be there with us. And Jesus at that moment doesn't hide what he's feeling. He doesn't put on a mask of detachment. He isn't wearing a veneer of fearlessness. He isn't pretending to be strong when he's scared. He says to his closest disciples, stay with me. My soul is overwhelmed. Now, understand, the disciples were not up to the challenge. They did not stay with Jesus the way he wanted. And when Jesus was arrested, they abandoned him, eventually denying they even knew him. But even still, Jesus turned to his closest friends and did not face his time of desperation alone. He trusted in God, he turned to his friends, and most importantly here, he maintained his integrity throughout. Now here's the amazing thing. He trusted God, but God said no. He turned to his friends, but his friends ran the other way. But at the moment that he was at his lowest, he was still the same Jesus he's always been. Before the arresting party, he was still the same Jesus as the one who healed a man with a missing ear. The one who walked on the water was still the same Jesus who cried in the garden. The one who raised the dead was still the same Jesus that sweated blood. The one who stood before an indifferent governor was the same Jesus who showed mercy to a thief on the cross. The one who walked out of an empty tomb is the same Jesus that hung on the cross. At his lowest moment, Jesus maintained his integrity. Neither his circumstances nor the condition of his heart could determine nor betray his identity. Jesus could face sleeping disciples. He could face the betrayal of friends. He could face multiple inquisitions. He could face the beating of guards. He could face a cross without changing who he was. Jesus maintained his integrity. How? Because Jesus had control of his soul. He knew who he was. He knew what to do. He had control of his soul. Our own souls are going to go through seasons of intense emotion. Our own souls are going to go through times of stress. There may be times in our lives that we feel like we could be at the point of death. That if this goes on any longer, I'm not going to make it. But even then, that doesn't have to change who we are. That doesn't have to change how we respond if we know how to keep control of our soul. Jesus had soul control. How are we doing?
If you'd like to discover more content like this, check out the VOUS Friends and Family Network, created to equip you with free resources and real relationships. And hey, don't miss out on the opportunity to be in the room next year for VOUSCon 2024, a gathering of global leaders designed to strengthen your faith and connect you to community.